I'm going to get right into today's topic. And today we're going to be covering classes. The function of a class is for us to create our own data types. So far we've been dealing with data types like the integer and the string and the list. But there may be cases where we want to create our own data types. Here's a motivating example. Let's say I'm an employee working for a big company and I'm writing an internal search tool that'll let me look at other employees and get their phone number so that I could chat with them. As a programmer, it'd make my life easier if I could represent an employee as an entity in my code. That way, I can collect relevant properties like the employee's age, the employee's name, the employee's phone number, all into one place that I can work with. Now, I'm going to get into how we can program a class and how we can use it. But first, I want to give another nice analogy that I like to bring up whenever I talk about classes. So, in the real world, scientists, let's say when they're given a set of new animals that we don't have a name for, will look at those animals and they will try to, based on the properties of those animals, classify those animals, hence the word class. So they're going to look at, let's say, 2 out of 10 of those animals, and they're going to be like, okay, these guys have these properties in common. So these properties probably identify some new species of animal, let's say dog, for example. So they're going to notice that dog has these specific properties. Just like that, in programming, we're going to do the same thing. So if we encounter a case where we're using 2 properties or 2 or more properties that seem to be related, we can easily relate those into one class. All right, let's get into coding class. As usual, I'm going to open up my terminal. Going to create the file that we're going to be writing our code in. First, I'm going to go to the desktop directory, create test. And you see here, that file was just created. I'm going to open that up with TextEdit. I'm going to remind you guys to remove rich text formatting in TextEdit. Go to plain text. And now we can get started. The first thing I want to do is teach you guys how to create the minimal class that you can. Okay, so Python gives us the class keyword for that, and after the class keyword, we have to type in the name of the class that we want to create. Now, inside of this new class code block, we can start typing in the properties that we want to associate to this class. So one of them is going to be age, one of them is going to be name, one of them is going to be email. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to assign default values of none to all of those variables. There's a reason for that. The reason for that is that we have yet to create a single employee that we can say, oh, that's Ronnie. He has this age and this name, or this email. So you can think as the class itself, the code for the class itself, as more of a template for creating employees that I can actually reference and work with than the actual employee itself. So now we're going to be creating the actual employees that we can work with. We're going to be instantiating the employee class. Instantiating is a technical term for creating an instance, which is a term for the concrete example, so to speak, of a class. So let's create an instance, okay? We're going to create emp equals, and to create an instance of a class, we have to do this. We have to type in the class name and then open parentheses, close parentheses. So if you take a step back, so far we've been creating data types or instances of data types using things like integer literals, right? So whenever we wanted to create an integer, we just type in an actual number. To create an employee, what we do, or to create an instance of any class, what we do is type in the class name and then open parentheses, close parentheses. So this is kind of the closest thing we have to an employee literal. Each employee is going to have its own version of these template variables, right? So we're going to give this employee his own version of those variables. So we're going to do emp.age, and this is how you reference a variable in a class. You're going to do instance name dot variable name, and then you're going to do equals, and then say 100. We're going to do emp.name equals Ronnie. So we're pretty much just populating the variables for this specific employee. Emp.email equals test at test.com. And now we have an actual instance. We have an instance of an employee that we can say, hey, that's Ronnie, and his age is this, and he has these variables, signs, and whatever. Now we can copy and paste this code block and create another employee, emp1, name him Steve or something. So point is, we have this template, so to speak, called the employee, that we can create actual employees from. If I was to print out emp.age, we would be accessing this specific employee's age, which is 100 that we assigned here. If we run that code, we should see that the age is 100. Or if we run, let's do email now too. Cool. Now, technically, you know how to create a class and instantiate it. And in one sense, we're done. Everything that I'm going to explain after this is in a way extra, or at least I say that because if you don't understand what I'm about to tell you, that's fine and you don't need to worry too much. But I'm going to get into the next part now. We can actually create functions inside of a class as well. So let's say we want a function to get the age of the employee. What we're going to do is create a function as usual in this code block, in the employee code block, and we're going to simply return the age. Now this part isn't so intuitive because this actually won't work. And the reason that this won't work is because, again, this class is a template. So for us to return the age of a template doesn't make sense because the template itself doesn't have an age. Only instances of the template of the employee class have an age. The way Python works around that is that every function inside of a class, or at least most of them, should have this parameter called self. Now this parameter actually represents the instance that you're calling this function from. So the instance that you're calling this function from means if I'm in the employee instance and then I call this function, the instance in this case is the emp. So think of like emp as being the variable that's being passed in here. So that means that instead of returning age, because age doesn't really have a meaning in this template, it only has a meaning with the instance, we would do emp, return emp.age, but emp is named self. So we're going to do self.age. So now we have this function that takes in the instance that the function is being called from. So in this case, again, the instance is emp, and it's going to return the age. Now Python is nice because when you call this function, when you call emp.getAge, Python already knows the instance that you're calling this function from. It knows that you're calling this function from emp. So instead of having you type in emp again here, it'll let you leave it blank. In fact, it requires you to leave it blank. So now we can print out the return value of emp.getAge. Bam, 100. Now here is something else, right? So we have this employee right now, and we defined it fully. We gave it all of its values, and it took us 4 lines to do that. But now, let's do something extra, and let us define this employee class in 1 line. So to do that, we actually have to define a special function in the class named init, init, underscore. And as with most functions in classes, we're going to type in self first. And what this function does, it will be called by Python when we run this line of code. So when we type in employee, open parentheses, close parentheses, what's really happening is that we're calling this function, which is pretty cool. So this is like Python magic behind the scenes, what's actually happening. So we call this class, which actually calls this function. And if you notice, it makes sense now why there's nothing in these parentheses, or why I even need parentheses. It's because there's nothing in these, there's no parameters to this init function. But if we wanted there to be parameters in this init function, let's say age, name, and email, then what we need to do is also pass them in here. So let's say create a literal for age, and now we create a string literal for name, and now we create another string literal for email. Cool. So now we can remove these. And now in this function, we should also set self.age to the age that we got from the function call. We should set self.name as the name we got from the function call. And we should set self.email as the email we got from the function call. Cool. Now we have a more standard looking class. So I hope this guide was useful in teaching you guys what a class is, why it exists, and how to use them. Thank you guys for tuning in, and I will make another video soon.